To all of you, I'm Leah Gabriel. President Trump is now on his way back to Washington after taking his America First agenda to a gathering of the global elite in Switzerland. The president touting a revival of the U.S. economy and American spirit, saying when America wins, the whole world benefits. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live in Davos. John, how was the president received there?
Leah, good evening to you. I mean, this whole thing was really kind of drenched in irony because here is an organization that snubbed him when he was a businessman, never invited him to come to Davos. A lot of these people who come here every year have been extremely critical of the president, yet they lined up for an hour to get in to see him, and there was a packed house, standing room only, as the president gave his speech. Really broke it down into three themes: the world working together against shared threats like North Korea's nuclear program, Iran's destabilizing behavior, as well as the threat from ISIS. One of the other themes was engaging with the world over trade, and then an unapologetic sales pitch, the president saying America is the place to do business with. Listen here.
America is the place to do business. So come to America, where you can innovate, create, and build. I believe in America. As president of the United States, I will always put America first, just like the leaders of other countries should put their country first also. But America first does not mean America alone. When the United States grows, so does the world.
Trade reform was one of the big issues that the president was pushing today in his speech in Davos. As he has said so many times, the United States has been taken advantage of when it comes to trade, and it's time for that to end. Listen here.
We cannot have free and open trade if some countries exploit the system at the expense of others. We support free trade, but it needs to be fair and it needs to be reciprocal, because in the end, unfair trade undermines us all.
Another issue that the president was dealing with today, a report that back in June he told his chief White House counsel, Don McGahn, to fire Bob Mueller, and was only convinced to not do it when McGahn said that he would quit if the president ordered him to do that. I mean, we reported on this, Leah, back in June of last year, and I checked with a number of sources this morning. I mean, none of the people I talked to said that the president said to Don McGahn, fire Bob Mueller. He said something to the effect of, if I wanted to, I could fire him. I have the authority to do that. Maybe even went so far as to ask Don McGahn to see if he could go talk to Rod Rosenstein, who is the Deputy Attorney General, who's in charge of the Special Counsel's office, to take his temperature on it. Apparently, when the president asked his White House counsel, Don McGahn, about that, McGahn shot back that it's a horrible idea. The hammer's going to come down on you if you do this. The whole thing's going to blow up in your face. So the president said, okay, well, we won't do it, but he would hold in reserve the idea of maybe firing Mueller if he thought that the investigation was going in an inappropriate direction. But as we've seen, Bob Mueller is still in his job, and the president has said repeatedly, after being asked about it at least a half a dozen times, if not more, Leah, no, he has no plans to fire Bob Mueller. Leah?
Well, I'm sure we'll be hearing lots more about specifically what was said. John Roberts in Davos, thank you.
Thanks, Leah.
President Trump, of course, taking his speech as an opportunity to promote America's economic progress while inviting other world powers to join in that success.
The world is witnessing the resurgence of a strong...
Roberts had to say just a moment ago that, as a private businessman, Donald Trump kind of got the cold shoulder from the crowd in Davos, and now that all of a sudden he's president, it's standing room only in the room to hear him.
Well, this is perhaps no surprise considering the stature of the U.S. presidency. Surprise being that Donald Trump had never been there before. But, at this point, he carries a lot more gravitas in this role, and he's got a lot more influence on the global events.
And you suggest that the policy or maybe the approach, the approach he's taking to the policy is evolving.
Yeah, when you look at the America First message during the campaign, that was pitched towards Americans saying, look, I've got your back. I'm going to make sure that people do not take advantage of America and hurt your prospects for economic prosperity. This message to world leaders, which we've seen over the last couple of months, has been also that America first doesn't mean it's only about America. It means that he's looking after America's interests, but it's not America alone, were his words. Meaning, like, he's opening the door here for partnerships and continued engagement with the world. And all along, this has been a matter of interpretation, right? And he's just putting the message into stark relief at this point for the world leaders.
Because some of our competitors, nations that have become our competitors on the world stage, China, India, do not necessarily have to follow the same rules that the U.S. does.
That's right. You know, when you're talking about trade and all of these other global arrangements, you know, there have not always been perfect balances between, you know, what America was seeking in terms of global influence and maybe what was best for the America domestic and economically speaking.
And speaking of economy, it is booming right now in this country.
Right, and the president made the point about that. And, you know, when he was talking about being open for business and being more competitive than ever, he's talking about all of the regulations that his administration has cut since he's taken office. He's talking about the tax reforms that he championed, and all of that has created this climate and has certainly pushed optimism in this country. We saw in the fourth quarter GDP numbers out today that the American consumer is feeling much more optimistic than we've seen in a while.
And if you're a businessman who wants to establish a factory or a company, I mean, you look for a number of things. You look for an educated workforce, you look for low taxation, low regulation, and especially a stable government, one that's going to, you know, is going to be there in 10 years.
Yeah, so those are some of the challenges still out there in terms of attracting that business. But we have seen, you know, Toyota and others coming in the recent months. One thing that we heard at Davos and our Wall Street Journal teams there have been reporting is that there's kind of a divide between some optimism among executives and concern about protectionism among world leaders. So there are still some relationship issues to be managed.
On that report that the president wanted to fire Robert Mueller, I thought, again, John Roberts' take on it was interesting. He's been digging around the White House, and they said, yeah, that there was some, you know, discussion of if. But, I mean, if the president really wanted to fire Robert Mueller, he could have done it, right?
That was one of the things that was explored back in June, as John mentioned, right? And then that was the report then. You know, I think there were, you know, always a frustration about this, and we heard from the president. He's been made no secret of, you know, criticizing his Attorney General Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from all of this, questioning whether there was a need for a special counsel, and just generally feeling like this was a distraction from what his presidency is trying to accomplish.
Glenn Hall from the Dow Jones News Service now. Glenn, thank you. Leah.
It was the tweet heard around the world. You may remember the false missile alert that sparked panic in Hawaii, where the investigation stands nearly 2 weeks later. Plus, the president is slamming a report by the New York Times, claiming that he tried to fire Robert Mueller. Our next guest is calling the story a deliberate leak to change the narrative as the Mueller investigation comes under scrutiny from lawmakers. The media panel is up next. But first, here's Mercedes Schlapp, White House Director of Strategic Communications. Listen.
Clearly, the New York Times is stirring up these months-old Russian conspiracy stories. The reality is that the president and this White House has been cooperative with the special counsel.
The Hawaii state employee who sent out a false missile alert is now refusing to cooperate with an investigation into the matter. Take a look at this. This is the alert that was sent out on January 13th, warning residents to seek immediate shelter from an inbound missile threat. The FCC says Hawaii's emergency management agency is helping with its investigation, but the employee is refusing to say more after giving an initial statement. If you remember, the message caused mass panic among the public for nearly 40 minutes. That was before authorities finally announced that it was a false alarm. Officials say the employee pushed the wrong button during a routine drill. He was reportedly disciplined and reassigned, but was not fired.
President Trump pushing back on reports that he tried to fire special counsel Robert Mueller last year. According to the New York Times, the president ordered the firing of Mueller in June, but backed off after White House lawyer Don McGahn threatened to resign over the issue. The president today denies the claim, calling the report fake news. He also slammed mainstream media coverage of him in general while attending the annual World Economic Forum in Davos.
I've always seemed to get, for whatever reason, a disproportionate amount of press or media. And throughout my whole life, somebody will explain someday why, but I've always gotten a lot. And as a businessman, I was always treated really well by the press. You know, the numbers speak and things happen, but I've always really had a very good press. And it wasn't until I became a politician that I realized how nasty, how mean, how vicious, and how fake the press can be.
Let's bring in our panel. Elizabeth Harrington is a staff writer for the Washington Free Beacon. Aaron Delmore is senior political correspondent for Bustle.com. I raised the point, Aaron, that I raised a moment ago with Glenn Hall. I mean, if the president is the top guy in the administration, if he wanted to fire Robert Mueller, he could have, right?
Absolutely. He has the power to do that. But back in August, he said that he had never considered firing the special counsel. We're seeing reports in June that he did consider it, that he went as far as to ask for it to be done. That goes against what he said, and it falls in line with a number of false or misleading statements by the president. More than 2,000 since he took office a year ago. That's more than 5 per day.
You have looked at this, Elizabeth. You don't necessarily find it all that credible.
Right. Well, isn't it curious that just as the Mueller probe and the entire premise of his investigation is coming under scrutiny with these text messages, with this FISA memo that's circulating on the Hill, that we have a deliberate leak to change the narrative. Now the media is in a frenzy. They're talking about obstruction. But what we really have here, Trump didn't fire anybody. Not firing someone doesn't sound like obstruction to me. But what does sound like obstruction is a top FBI agent communicating months before he's about to interview Hillary Clinton that he agrees he should go easy on her for political reasons. That sounds more like obstruction into an investigation than not firing someone, which is what this report intentionally leaked by the Mueller team as a distraction shows.
I suppose, Aaron, that, you know, there would be, in a White House like this, there would be a lot of back and forth about, you know, should we fire him, should we not? Your point is that the president has said that he had never considered it, but apparently he did, and that's part of the criticism here, I guess?
Well, now I'm going to take issue with Elizabeth's point that this detail was deliberately leaked by the Mueller team. I've got to ask, how do you know that?
Because there's reports that say this was just learned in recent months by the investigation, these new developments. So who leaked it? If they're the ones that knew it, that's what the media story actually implies. And why did this story come out 2 hours after these text messages were leaked from Grassley on the Hill that deliberately show the bias of the top FBI agent on Mueller's team, that shows that he wants to go easy on Hillary Clinton because she could be our next president? I mean, how is that just a coincidence, you think?
I disagree with you that the story implies that that was the source, and I think that this is a valid piece of the Russia investigation.
But if it didn't happen, then what's the net effect, Aaron?
Well, we've seen a pattern from President Trump to try to diminish the roles of people on his team, whether it's the Deputy Attorney General, whether it's Andrew McCabe, whether it's Jeff Sessions, whether it is James Comey. All of this becomes important to the Mueller investigation.
And Elizabeth, your take is that it was leaked to try to distract, I guess, from some of the other efforts that seem to be underway to diminish or tarnish the Trump administration.
Yes, we've seen a complete change in narrative now. All the other cable news networks are now in a frenzy calling it obstruction. But I'd like to ask, obstruction of what exactly? Obstruction of a fishing expedition that has no connection to the initial purpose of the investigation, which was Russia meddling in the election. We're so far down a completely different path. And now we're saying that, oh, Trump, it's laughable when you have Democratic lawyers like Mark Elias saying this New York Times story shows intent of Trump to obstruct justice, when it was Hillary Clinton's intent to set up a private email server and misuse classified information, mishandle classified information. That was the whole question, right? And Comey said, oh, well, we don't have to consider her intent because she didn't really mean any harm. When Peter Strzok is the one who changed the language to reckless instead of the criminal statute, which was extremely reckless and disregarding classified information. Here you have the top agent had a hand in this Hillary investigation and then also was brought into the Trump Mueller probe. And he was completely biased against Trump. We've seen it. He was fired from it. Just as all these text messages are coming out to expose that, now what is the media jumping onto? A 6-month-old story, which they already had practically reported that Trump had been considering firing Mueller. Well, but the fact is he didn't fire Mueller.
These are interesting times in Washington, that is for sure. It gives us all a lot to cover. Elizabeth Harrington from the Washington Free Beacon, Aaron Delmore, Bustle.com. Thank you.
You bet.
South Korea dealing with its deadliest fire in years, where flames broke out and left nearly 40 people dead, plus this.
I'm on board the pinnacle of American maritime engineering, the fastest ocean liner in the world, arguably almost as famous as the Titanic. Only this one never sank. Coming up, why the SS United States is now sending out an SOS.
Flames ripping through a South Korean hospital, killing at least 37 people, marking the country's deadliest fire in years. It broke out in the hospital's emergency room, and then it quickly spread through the first floor. Nearly 130 people were injured. The head of the foundation that runs the hospital saying that the hospital did not have sprinklers because it is not required by law. The cause still under investigation.
You know, some of the greatest symbols of America are found in Philadelphia. The Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, for instance. Another of America's industrial historical icons is there as well. Easily seen by passersby, yet almost impossible to tour. It's the 65-year-old ship that bears the name of this nation. And right now, the SS United States is in real trouble.
The new 53,000-ton liner United States.
This is America's flagship, the SS United States. Is there anything else in the United States that is named the United States?
Arguably, this is it, John, and that's one of the reasons why she's America's flagship.
This once grand vessel is many things. A luxury ocean liner of nearly 1,000 feet, almost as long as New York's Chrysler Building is tall, fully 100 feet longer than the Titanic. She proudly wears a Made in America label as the largest passenger ship ever built entirely in the U.S.
We talk a lot about American made today, John, and this ship is the epitome of it. There were people and companies from every state in the nation that built this ship.
In her heyday, she carried roughly would be used in the construction to keep her fireproof. The only exceptions he allowed on board, butcher blocks in the kitchen, and the grand pianos Steinway made from a special fire-resistant mahogany. Susan Gibbs is the designer's granddaughter. What are the stories you remember from childhood about your grandfather and this ship?
There's sort of jokes about, did he love this ship more than my grandmother? And he would always say, yes, 1,000 times yes.
She is also the fastest passenger ship in the world.
While she has every modern comfort, the United States has been constructed primarily for power and speed.
On her maiden voyage in 1952, the ship smashed the transatlantic speed record. Using only 2/3 of her awesome power, she sliced through the sea at 44 miles an hour, cutting 10 hours off the previous record, giving her high-profile clients more time to tend to their interests on dry land. So talk about some of those A-list celebrities. Who was on this ship?
Oh, well, anybody from Marlon Brando to John Wayne.
Marilyn Monroe, as I understand.
If you were an A-lister, you were here. President Eisenhower, President Truman, President Kennedy, even Bill Clinton, when he was a Rhodes Scholar going over to Europe, traveled on board the SS United States as a kid.
So this ship has seen more U.S. presidents as passengers than any other?
Than any other vessel.
A draw for celebrities, dignitaries, and presidents, the SS United States was so much more. A symbol of American ingenuity, prestige, and pride. But she also stood ready as a Cold War weapon, prepared in case of need to protect the nation who gave her her name. There was a military aspect to this ship, right? It was a top-secret design.
She was a top-secret ship in addition to a luxury liner. She was a Cold War asset. And so she could be quickly converted from luxury liner to a troop ship and transport up to 15,000 troops 10,000 miles without refueling. So her whole shape, the propeller here, this was all top secret.
But for its incredible speed and the technology built into this vessel, the SS United States fell victim to a newer technology, the jet engine.
Fewer and fewer people were willing to spend 4 to 5 days traveling to Europe when they could get in a plane and travel for 6 or 7 hours.
She was retired from active duty in 1969 after only 17 years of service. Today, her walls, once adorned with beautiful artwork, are bare, even the paint peeling away. The lights long dimmed in the grand ballroom, the live music gone silent. The decks of the majestic vessel now deserted and decaying. The SS United States floats in a Philadelphia shipyard, rusting and in desperate need of restoration. A grassroots organization is fighting to keep her intact. Tom Basile is the spokesman for the SS United States Conservancy.
And the idea that they would just cut it up into scrap just seems so tragic.
It would be. It would be a real tragedy because this ship, it's as important a symbol for this country as the Liberty Bell or as the Washington Monument. It's that special.
It would be such a loss, such a crime against history for this ship to be cut up into razor blades. We just can't let that happen.
Now, it costs, what, $60,000 a month just to keep this ship berthed here?
It does. $60,000 a month, and this is a grassroots organization that has built a global community of supporters to help keep the ship in the water. We haven't taken a dime of government money, but we're at a point now where not only do we need Americans to step forward, we need people to realize how important a symbol this ship is. We need the president to take notice and Congress to take notice about how we can work together as a nation, come together as a country to save America's flagship.
Some cruise lines have shown interest over the years in buying and refurbishing the ship, but because of changing consumer tastes and technological requirements, restoring her to active use would be cost prohibitive. Still, Basile holds out hope that Americans will save her to keep her history alive and preserve the United States' unique place in American history.
Our country is a singular, extraordinary expression, and so is this ship. She matches her namesake really well, and that's why it's emotional. You see her name emblazoned on the bow of this ship and you see it rust. Great nations don't allow their history to rust or be destroyed, especially something that is named after our great nation.
So she probably won't carry passengers again. Incidentally, this ship could go in reverse as fast as the Titanic could go forward.
Wow, unbelievable. You know, you do see United States across the bow, and you do think about the greatness of the American power. I want to know, though, when you were on this ship, comparing the pictures to what you see now, could you imagine what it must have been like in its day?
Sure. And what they would like to do is to be able to tow it to a seaport city and, you know, turn it into a museum or a shopping mall or even a condominium or an office project, and just have it there for people to be able to see and walk aboard and touch.
Well, it would definitely be a pretty neat place to live if it was a kind of, but there's a way to donate, right?
Well, wearetheunitedstates.org is the grassroots organization that's trying to save the ship. You can check them out. You can also check out foxnews.com/lifestyle. We have more information there and a slideshow of old and new pictures of that ship.
Yeah, those pictures are pretty amazing. It's just incredible to think of all the people who were on that ship, the celebrities, the presidents that you mentioned.
It was sort of the space shuttle of its day. It was that kind of a symbol of America.
I like that analogy. All right, great story, John.
Thanks.
Well, President Trump leaving Davos after delivering his message of America first to world economic leaders. The president also pressing his case for immigration reform as his team lays out a proposal that could include a path to citizenship for dreamers. But will Congress get on board? Well, the White House now proposing a path to citizenship for nearly 2 million so-called dreamers. That would be in exchange for funding for a border wall. But Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is skeptical of the president's new position. Listen.
We must seek a budget deal an agreement on health care legislation, and a bipartisan bill to protect the Dreamers and provide for border security. All these items are important. All of them are urgent. And we are working hard to get them all done. On the issue of immigration, the bipartisan group of moderate senators should continue trying to find a consensus. I think that's an excellent idea. The White House, unfortunately, has proven unreliable and wildly unpredictable.
Well, let's bring in our panel. Tiffany Cross, co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC, and Gianno Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Strategic Consulting and a Fox News political analyst. Nice to see you both.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I would like to start with you first, Tiffany. What is your initial reaction to this framework?
Well, I think it's really hard to nail this administration down on exactly how they feel about immigration. Trump will say one thing on Monday and something different on Thursday. So in terms of the framework, I think it's really disturbing that although the president is giving citizens or these Dreamers a path to citizenship, he's doing so by making it impossible for 3 times the amount of legal immigration. And these are legal immigrants who come to this country to help make it great again, as the president loves to say. And these are people who are CEOs in this country, who are job creators. The CEO of Google is an immigrant. The CEO of Tesla is an immigrant. So I'm really concerned that though he has, made some concessions on giving Dreamers a path to citizenship, he's doing so at a huge cost. And nobody on the right or the left seems to be happy with this legislation.
And I want to go over to Gianno on that, because Gianno, I saw from the notes that you sent us ahead of time that you don't really like this either.
No, I don't. And I guess President Trump calling himself a deal maker in chief was a complete fallacy in the sense that the president is giving everything away, the cake and all the toppings. And this proposal is a generous smack in the face to every individual that comes to this country legally. I'm all for protecting Dreamers, individuals that come to this country at no fault of their own, which is a very important phrase. However, this proposal goes far beyond that, providing a pathway to citizenship for 1.8 million people and likely a whole lot more beyond the current 700,000 people that signed up for the deferred action for childhood arrivals figure that we've been discussing for the past few months. So in essence, this proposal to me makes President Obama's DACA program look like a conservative choice. This is beyond what I ever would have expected from President Trump.
All right, Tiffany, back to you then. So those on the far right don't like it, those on the far left don't like it. Doesn't that sound a lot like what we call a compromise?
I don't think so. I think the biggest challenge I have with it is because of this empty campaign promise that the president made, that he wants to put a $25 billion debt on the back of American taxpayers to build this ridiculous border wall, when his own ICE administration says that the numbers of border crossings have gone down. So that's been the huge sticking point. I would echo Congressman Luis Gutierrez, who tweeted out and said it would be easier to erect a huge concrete middle finger to Latin America. That's essentially what this legislation is. So a compromise, I think, is something that at least makes sense. I don't think this legislation makes sense to anybody on the right or the left. Even the Heritage Foundation has called it a non-starter. So though we both don't like it, we disagree for different reasons.
Well, I think those on the right would say that the lower number of illegal immigrants coming to the country is partly a result of President Trump being in office and his administration. But Gianno, I want to go over to you on this one. The White House seems to feel like this is sort of a point to begin with to ultimately get legislation that would end up in conference. What say you to that idea?
So the only thing that makes me feel comfortable about this proposal is the fact that it's only a proposal. And these major giveaways won't fly when it comes to conservative caucuses in Congress. So this is a good thing to get 60 votes in the Senate. And we know that people like the Tea Party and others, the Freedom Caucus, they're going to say, hey, this isn't something that we should do. And they'll probably push a bill out of the House and we can take it to conference. But at the end of the day, it's kind of interesting to me, and I don't consider myself to be on the far right. I'm more in the middle. I'm a conservative, but I'm definitely more in the middle. But it's interesting that I see folks on the left complaining about this when this is the most liberal policy that they have come out of a Republican administration. This is something they should be praising President Trump for. This is something that we never expected. And I understand what Chuck Schumer is saying when he says, hey, this is an unpredictable president, because at this point, no one who supported President Trump or Republicans in general thought that a proposal like this would come from this White House.
Well, I think the issue is, will it get the ball rolling? And that's what we'll be all waiting to see if it happens. Tiffany Cross, Gianno Caldwell, thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, the largest and most recognizable symbol of American might soon make a stop in Vietnam. How this historic move could be all about sending a message to China. Plus, notorious drug lord El Chapo making a promise to jurors ahead of his upcoming federal trial.
Sunday, on the next edition of Scandalous, the Paula Jones case hits the courtroom.
We said, look, Mr. President, you have to answer these charges.
A major shakeup in the investigation.
Ken Starr was regarded as Republican and quite conservative.
And the shutdown that led to the first infamous White House encounter. Sunday, it all kicks off at the premiere that had everyone talking. Then, don't miss episode 2, A Woman Named Paula.
Of the murdered. That promise included an motion filed by Guzman's attorney. Prosecutors want to keep the jury anonymous and under protection. They say he's tried to silence witnesses in the past, but defense lawyers say that sends a message to jurors that Guzman is dangerous and probably guilty. He's finally facing trial in the U.S. after making several dramatic escapes from custody in Mexico. The judge has not yet ruled on the motion.
Breaking now, the U.S. Navy preparing to send an aircraft carrier to Vietnam for the first time since the end of the Vietnam War. The USS Carl Vinson sent to dock in the country in what experts say is a direct message to China. Joining me now is Christopher Swift, attorney and Georgetown University professor of national security studies. Nice to see you.
Good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So those of us who've served in the Navy say that a U.S. aircraft carrier going anywhere in the world is a big symbol of diplomacy. What do you make of this decision?
Well, it's certainly a symbol of outreach to Vietnam and the Vietnamese government, which has been increasingly interested in forming, shall we say, an informal partnership with the United States to manage China's activities in the South China Sea. The deployment of the USS Carl Vinson or any other carrier battle group to Vietnam would not only be historic in terms of U.S.-Vietnamese relations and showing how much those relations have improved, but it would also send a very powerful signal to Beijing that the United States cares about what it's doing in the South China Sea and has an interest in preserving the independence and autonomy of sovereign countries like Vietnam.
So this would be going into Da Nang, which is where the first conventional American combat unit was deployed in the Vietnam War, so certainly symbolic. But you mentioned China and the South China Sea. We know China has been building on top of islands there that are disputed territorial islands. Now, Secretary Mattis, in speaking about this, said that, quote, freedom of navigation and access in the South China Sea will be critical to Vietnam economically and, of course, in their security efforts. I want to key in on him saying freedom of navigation and your legal brain on this one, because he's clearly using those words for a reason. Explain.
Yeah, that's right. There's two reasons why we care about the term freedom of navigation. The first is that under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, unless you're within that 12-mile limit, what's called the territorial sea of a country, there's supposed to be no restraint on your ability to move through water from one country to another, from one port to another. The exception to that would be a UN embargo or economic sanctions that have a multilateral effect. But generally speaking, if you're outside the 12-mile limit, those territorial waters, no one's supposed to be getting in your way to operate or navigate. It's also important because China, as it's building up these islands in strategic locations throughout the South China Sea, is asserting its ability to interfere with the shipping of other countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, and others in the region. And so one of the U.S. primary interests in the South China Sea is to maintain freedom of navigation, both for commercial and for strategic reasons, and also to limit China's ability to make the argument that they control the area.
And China certainly is trying to make that argument. In fact, China was complaining that a U.S. guided missile destroyer went around 12 miles from Scarborough Shoal. What do you make of how China is trying to reclaim these islands, and then when U.S. aircraft or when U.S. ships are passing through under freedom of navigation, complaining about it?
Well, look, the Chinese government has an interest in asserting its influence not just in Asia generally, but in the littoral waters off Asia's shores. The South China Sea is a major transshipment point for world commerce. It's a source of potential oil and gas and other minerals. And the Chinese government is trying to have their cake and eat it too by creating facts on the ground with these new islands and by encouraging the United States and others to stay away from those locations. Look, it's perfectly fine for you to be outside to transit an island or other location if you're outside the 12-mile limit. If you get inside that 12-mile limit, you're supposed to identify and have yourself to the local authorities and get permission to be there. That's been international law for hundreds of years, and it's engineer.
He told investigators he misjudged the location of the Amtrak train and missed a signal that would have alerted him to an upcoming curve. 3 people were killed, dozens more injured when the train hurtled around that curve at twice the speed limit and ran off the tracks in DuPont, Washington. The train was traveling along a new high-speed route from Seattle to Portland when the derailment occurred.
A suspect in the murder of a Colorado sheriff's deputy is set to make his first court appearance today. Meanwhile, authorities are still searching for 2 more men who are possibly connected to that case. William Lajeunesse is live in Los Angeles. William, what do we know?
Well, police believe the man that they have in custody likely knows the other 2 suspects who are still on the run. Now, this all began when up to 10 men assaulted a woman Wednesday night in North Denver, prompting witnesses to call 911. Deputies respond, and the suspects ran.
It started out with and then into a pound, and I saw a tall man about 6 foot wearing all black clothes and a hoodie running through my yard, running away from my door.
When Deputy Heath Gum cornered one man in a backyard, the suspect fired. The bullet somehow got through or missed Gum's vest. The alleged shooter is a 22-year-old convict now charged with first-degree murder. In 2013, at age 17, he beat a man unconscious. The next day, he assaulted a woman and stole her iPad. He served 2 years of a 4-year sentence. Police asked the media not to share his identity until his court appearance later today. Now, Sheriff Mike McIntosh remembered Gum, a 5-year veteran of his sheriff's department, as a thoughtful, gentle, caring deputy.
Serving in law enforcement is a shared sacrifice, and the families of our deputies and law enforcement officers across Colorado appreciate the outpouring of support and prayers.
So the manhunt for those 2 other suspects does continue, but again, they are not wanted in the murder. Gum is survived by his wife and parents. He is the 2nd officer killed in the line of duty in Denver in the last 30 days. Back to you.
All right, William Lajeunesse.